afternoon sun cast a golden hue across the abandoned house, its peeling paint and boarded windows hinting at years of neglect. Claire Alden adjusted her scarf against the biting autumn breeze and stepped inside, the wooden floor groaning beneath her sensible boots. She clutched her notepad and phone tightly, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and unease. Perfect for the article, she muttered, running a hand over the dusty banister. As a history teacher and part-time blogger, Claire had a knack for finding forgotten places with stories begging to be told. This house, rumoured to have belonged to a reclusive spiritualist in the late 1800s, was her latest project. Claire wandered through the dilapidated rooms, snapping photos of faded wallpaper and toppled furniture. The air smelled of mildew and decay, but she pressed on. She reached a small study at the back of the house, where a sliver of sunlight cut through the grime-coated window. The room was almost untouched. An old desk, a chair, and a wooden trunk sat like relics of a bygone era. The trunk caught her eye immediately. It was ornate, its surface carved with swirling patterns that almost seemed to writhe under her gaze. She knelt beside it, her curiosity outweighing her trepidation. The rusted latch gave way with a loud creak, and Claire pulled the lid open, coughing as a cloud of dust rose. Inside, wrapped in brittle brown paper, was an antique photo album. Claire's fingers trembled as she unwrapped it, revealing a worn leather cover embossed with faint gold lettering, the Spirit Circle. She opened it gingerly, her pulse quickening as she examined the photographs inside. Each one was sepia-toned, depicting Victorian séance circles with solemn-faced participants. Ghostly apparitions floated in the background, translucent figures with hollow eyes and blurred outlines. Her gaze lingered on one photograph in particular. It showed a group of women seated around a table, their hands linked. Behind them stood a faint figure, a woman with dark, piercing eyes and an unnervingly sharp gaze. Unlike the others, her expression wasn't neutral. It was almost as if she were looking directly at Claire. Claire shuddered, but couldn't look away. "Creepy, but fascinating," she whispered, running a finger over the cracked surface of the photo. Her historian's instincts overpowered her discomfort. This album could be a treasure trove of material for her blog, a glimpse into the Victorian obsession with the supernatural. She placed the album in her bag, ignoring the prickle of unease that crawled up her spine. The room seemed colder now, but she dismissed it as her imagination. After all, the house was old, and the weather wasn't helping. As Claire prepared to leave, she felt a strange compulsion to glance back at the desk. A shadow flickered in the corner of her eye, but when she turned, the room was empty. "Probably just the light," she told herself, though her voice lacked conviction. Back at her small, book-filled apartment, Claire set the album on her desk and brewed a cup of tea. The unease she'd felt in the house had faded, replaced by her usual curiosity. She flipped through the pages again, this time examining the photos more closely. She found herself drawn to the same woman, the one with the dark eyes. Every time Claire turned the page, she half expected the woman's expression to change, but of course it didn't. Still, there was something about her, something that made Claire's stomach twist. She snapped a few photos of the album with her phone, mentally drafting the blog post she'd write, "Forgotten Rituals of the 19th Century." It was sure to intrigue her readers. As she closed the album, a chill swept through the room, causing her to shiver. The desk lamp flickered once, then stabilized. Claire laughed nervously. "Get a grip, Claire. It's just an old book." But as she settled into bed that night, the image of the woman with the piercing gaze lingered in her mind. For the first time in years, Claire felt uneasy in her own home, and as the clock struck midnight, she didn't notice the faint sound of paper rustling on her desk. The album lay closed, but the photograph of the séance seemed brighter, as if the figures inside were illuminated by a light not of this world. In the background, the woman's eyes seemed to gleam with quiet malice. The morning sun filtered through Claire's curtains, casting soft streaks of light across her desk. She sipped her coffee, scrolling through the photos she'd taken of the séance album on her phone. The eerie woman with the dark, piercing eyes stared back at her from the screen, her expression unsettlingly lifelike. Claire shivered and set her phone aside. "You're just letting your imagination run wild," she muttered, brushing the thought away, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That evening, Claire settled into her armchair with a glass of wine and a mystery novel, eager to distract herself. The album sat on her desk, its cracked leather cover catching the lamplight. She glanced at it, her curiosity battling her unease. Eventually, she gave in, setting her book aside and flipping through the photos again. As she examined the images, something felt different. The ghostly woman seemed closer, her features sharper, her eyes darker. Claire frowned, holding the album up to the light. She could have sworn the woman had been farther back in the photograph before. "Old photos degrade," she told herself, though her voice sounded hollow. Just as she closed the album, a faint creak echoed through the room. Claire froze, her pulse quickening. She glanced toward the window, but it was shut tight. The apartment was empty, or so she thought. "Probably the building settling," she muttered, trying to convince herself. But as she stood to turn off the light, something caught her eye. In the glass of the window, a faint reflection lingered, her own face and someone else's. It was her, the woman from the photograph. Claire spun around, her heart pounding, but the room was empty. She laughed nervously, running a hand through her hair. "Great, now I'm seeing things." She decided to go to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the woman's face, those dark, unyielding eyes burning into her mind. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of standing in a dark room, surrounded by shadows that whispered her name. The next morning, Claire tried to shake off the unease. She went about her day as usual, teaching her classes and chatting with colleagues, but a gnawing dread lingered at the edge of her mind. By the time she returned home, the apartment felt unnervingly cold, despite the mild autumn weather. As she unpacked her bag, she noticed the album had moved. She was certain she'd left it closed on her desk, but now it sat open. The pages fanned out, as if someone had been flipping through them. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The photograph of the séance was on display, and this time the woman's expression had changed. Her lips were curled into a faint smile, her eyes fixed directly on Claire. "No, that's not possible," Claire whispered, stumbling back. She grabbed her phone and took a picture of the photo, desperate to prove to herself that she wasn't losing her mind. But when she looked at the screen, the woman wasn't there. The space behind the séance circle was empty. A loud knock jolted her, and Claire nearly dropped her phone. Heart racing, she opened the door to her neighbour, an elderly woman named Mrs. Abbott. "Sorry to bother you, dear," Mrs. Abbott said, peering into Claire's apartment. "I thought I heard talking. Are you all right?" Claire forced a smile, her voice trembling. "Just a little jumpy, I guess. Thanks for checking." Mrs. Abbott hesitated, her gaze drifting past Claire. "You're not alone in there, are you?" "No," Claire said quickly, shutting the door. She leaned against it, her breathing shallow. She could still hear the whispers from her dream, faint and insistent. That night, as she lay in bed, Claire's fear turned to resolve. She grabbed the album and carried it to the kitchen. "This thing is going in the trash," she said aloud, hoping the sound of her own voice would steady her nerves. But when she opened the bin, she hesitated. The album seemed to hum faintly in her hands, as though it were alive. A cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the candle on the counter. Claire froze. In the darkness, a voice whispered, soft but distinct, "Join us." Her grip on the album loosened, and it fell to the floor, landing open on the same photograph. The woman's smile had grown wider, her hand now extended outward, as if inviting Claire into the circle. Claire stumbled back, her heart pounding. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward her, their edges curling like smoke, and in the glass of the kitchen window, the woman's reflection stared back, her lips moving in a silent chant. Claire fled to her bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. She pressed her back against it, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The whispers grew louder, and from the corner of her eye, she saw movement in the mirror across the room. The woman was there, standing just behind her. Claire had hardly slept. Her dreams were fragmented, a swirl of dark eyes, shadowy hands and whispers she couldn't decipher. She woke before dawn, her apartment heavy with silence, her heart pounding. The album sat untouched on her desk, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the room like an unwanted guest. Determined to clear her head, Claire left her apartment early. The crisp morning air and bustling streets brought her a small measure of comfort. She decided to stop by her favourite cafe, hoping the routine would steady her nerves. The coffee shop's large glass windows reflected the early sun, the glare almost blinding as she approached. She reached for the door but froze mid-step. In the window's reflection, among the milling crowd, was a face. Her face. And behind her, the woman. The figure stood unnaturally still, her dark eyes boring into Claire's through the glass. One pale hand was outstretched, her fingers curling in a slow, deliberate beckon. Claire whirled around, her pulse hammering, but the sidewalk was empty. A few strangers passed her with indifferent expressions, but there was no sign of the woman. She turned back to the window, but the figure was gone. Her coffee remained untouched as Claire sat in the cafe, staring blankly at her phone. She wanted to convince herself it was her imagination, a trick call of the light, but she couldn't shake the image. The woman's hand, so pale, so sharp, reached for her mind even now. Back at her apartment, Claire avoided the album. She kept herself busy with chores and research for her next class, but every time she glanced at the desk, the cracked leather cover seemed to draw her in. The shadows in her apartment stretched long, even as the afternoon sun poured through the windows. As dusk settled, Claire moved to the bathroom to splash water on her face. She felt exhausted, her nerves frayed to the edge. She looked up into the mirror, and her breath caught. The woman was there, behind her. This time, the figure was closer, her face sharper, the black voids of her eyes glimmering faintly. Her lips moved, forming words Claire couldn't hear. The woman's hand rose slowly, pressing against the mirror's surface, as though it were a thin veil between them. "No," Claire whispered. Stepping back, she clutched the edge of the sink, willing the image to disappear. "This isn't real." The woman tilted her head, her mouth forming one word, "Come." The mirror rippled like water, and Claire stumbled out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut. She stood in the hallway, her heart racing, the sound of her breathing loud in her ears. Her phone buzzed on the counter, startling her. She snatched it up, desperate for distraction, but when she glanced at the screen, her stomach dropped. The wallpaper, a serene photo of a beach, had changed. It now showed the photograph from the album, the séance circle, with the woman's piercing eyes staring back. Claire threw the phone onto the couch and grabbed the album, her hands trembling. "This has to stop," she muttered, flipping to the photograph of the séance. The image had changed. The figures, seated around the table, were no longer faceless. Their heads were tilted up, their mouths open in silent screams. The woman's hand was fully extended, her fingers now almost breaching the edge of the photograph. Claire dropped the album, backing away as it hit the floor. She turned toward the window, the urge to escape overwhelming, but as she approached, the glass began to fog unnaturally, the faint outline of a hand pressed against it from the outside. Her legs wobbled as she backed into the desk. The album lay open, its pages rustling as though caught in a breeze. The woman's voice echoed faintly through the room, a low chant that grew louder with each passing second. Join us. Complete the circle. Claire screamed, clutching her head as the whispers invaded her thoughts. The reflection of the woman filled every surface. The windows, the TV screen, even her phone. No matter where she looked, those dark, soulless eyes followed her, beckoning her towards something she couldn't understand. The room seemed to close in on her, the shadows growing deeper, the whispers deafening. With trembling hands, Claire grabbed the album and shoved it into a bag. She had to get rid of it, to put as much distance between herself and this cursed thing as possible. But as she stepped into the hallway, the whispers didn't stop. The woman's voice was clearer now, cold and commanding. There is no escape. Claire turned, and at the end of the dim corridor, she saw her. The woman stood still, her hand outstretched, her lips forming that same single word. Come. And for the briefest moment, Claire felt her feet begin to move. Claire's chest heaved as she pressed herself against the door of her bedroom. The whispers echoed louder now, filling the room with their chilling chant. The walls seemed to pulse with shadows, curling and stretching as though alive. Her head spun, her pulse quickening to a deafening rhythm. The album lay open on the floor, its pages rustling as if stirred by an unseen breeze. She couldn't bring herself to move closer, but her eyes locked onto the photograph of the séance circle. The woman's hand, once confined to the picture, now seemed to reach out into her world. No! Claire screamed as the room erupted in a blinding flash of light. When the light subsided, Claire found herself seated at a wooden table. Her hands trembled as she realized that they were clasped with the hands of others. The table was illuminated by flickering candles, casting ghostly shadows across the room. She wasn't in her apartment anymore. The room was unfamiliar, yet eerily familiar. It was the setting of the photograph, the séance circle. She looked around in terror. The women surrounding her were dressed in Victorian attire, their faces pale and expressionless, all except one, the woman with the dark, piercing eyes. She stood at the head of the table, watching Claire with an unsettling smile. "What is this?" Claire whispered, her voice shaking. The woman leaned forward, her face inches from Claire's. "You have joined the circle. You are now one of us." Claire looked down and gasped. She was dressed in a tattered Victorian gown, her hands thin and pale, the skin translucent. She tried to move, to stand, but her body refused to obey. She was bound to the chair, as if the room itself held her captive. The others around the table turned their heads slowly to face her. Their hollow eyes reflected her fear. Their mouths opened in unison, whispering words she couldn't understand. The chant grew louder, reverberating through the room. "Let me go!" Claire screamed, pulling against the invisible force that held her. The woman with the dark eyes placed a cold hand on Claire's shoulder. "You took her place," she said, gesturing to an empty chair across the table. "And now she walks free." Claire's vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she saw her apartment, her desk, her chair, the faint glow of her lamp, but standing in the centre of the room was a figure. It was one of the original women from the séance, her Victorian dress rippling as though caught in an invisible breeze. She touched the objects in the room with curiosity, her pale lips curling into a satisfied smile. "Claire," the woman said, her voice echoing through both worlds, "you've given me life." "No," Claire shouted, her voice cracking. She struggled against the force keeping her in the chair. The others around the table began to weep softly, their tears glimmering in the candlelight. One of them leaned toward Claire and whispered, "We all tried. None of us succeeded." In Claire's apartment, the freed woman wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows one by one, filling the small space. Men and women in Victorian attire stood in silence, their faces pale and lifeless. They gathered around the desk, their hollow eyes fixed on the photograph. The freed woman turned to them, her expression triumphant. "Another joins us." "Welcome, sister," she said, her voice calm yet cold. Claire, still trapped in the séance circle, heard their voices echoing in her mind. "Join us. We have much to do, for we are many." Claire's heart sank as she heard the final words spoken in unison by the figures, their voices resonating with a chilling power. "We are legion." In her final moments of clarity, Claire realized the horrifying truth. The woman who had replaced her and the others before her were now loose in the world, and she, like the many before her, was trapped dead in the photograph, forever a part of the séance, waiting for the next unwitting soul to take her place. The album on the desk rustled once more, its pages turning as though by an unseen hand. The photograph of the séance circle had changed again. At the table, Claire's face now stared out in silent despair, her mouth open in an eternal scream.